Welcome into the Backroads Build podcast. I'm Ben, and last week we teased this episode coming up, and you might have noticed that this is a bit of a longer episode. It's actually over an hour long, and you might say that's a lot, but that's because of the guests that we had on and the amazing story they shared. We are very excited to have two guests on the show that have an absolutely incredible story. One of them lived this 2-year-long adventure that saw himself alongside his father and his brother, who was also there for about half the journey. They canoed from Winnipeg all the way down through the Mississippi, along the coast of Mexico, all the way to Brazil. That's over 20,000 kilometers, and they traveled the whole way via canoe. It is an amazing story. Our other guest recreated this story many years later into an absolutely amazing documentary. So strap on in, because this is the story behind the story of Paddle to the Amazon. Well, we'd like to welcome into the podcast this week two guests who are joining us over the internet to discuss this amazing journey that was immortalized into a novel called Paddle to the Amazon. And then that book was the inspiration for a documentary of the same name. So today we were very honored to have Dana Starkel, whose father Don wrote the book Paddle to the Amazon, and was Dana and Don were both part of this crazy journey that saw them go over 12,000 miles, 20,000 kilometers from all the way up from Manitoba to the Amazon and back. And we also have Chris Ford, who is the man who helped make this documentary. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, nice to see you there, Ben.
So, Bill, I'm going to throw over to you because you are the best at doing these kind of synopses. So why don't you give the listeners a bit of an introduction to what Paddle the Amazon is and why we wanted to bring these two guys onto the podcast?
Well, we're going to find about this from both of them. But it was a one-way voyage, that's for sure, from the Red River all the way down to the Amazon. And when they calculate the distance, it's phenomenal, and it made the Guinness Book of Records. And when I started thinking about this, I thought, people say, well, where are you going to go next? And then again, the book came to my memory, and I thought, I'm going to find these people. And it was just by happenstance that found Chris Ford, documentary film producer. And then I thought, well, we'll find Dana, and through Chris, and this all happened to fall in, and we're so privileged to have both of them on the podcast, and we're gonna find out different aspects of. We can't talk about all the details, but we'll talk about it in a macro level, and some things that maybe have never been discussed before. I'm not sure about that, but I'm ready with my first question, Ben. I don't know. Yeah, well, I want to ask you both actually, and you can start with Dana. That I'd like you to tell us, either by example or by reference, when I listen and watch the documentary, and sometimes I've watched it a couple or three times. I've also listened to it without the visuals. And I listened to Don when you were doing the second expedition, and I think about, he was a really matter-of-fact kind of man. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then we'll switch over to Chris about the first time he met Don Starkel. Okay. Take it away, Dana.
Sure. I think you kind of are looking at him in an accurate way, Bill. That it didn't really matter what it was. Whatever my dad was planning, it could be like when he was trying to make 1,000 bottles of wine. He approached it always the same way. He would set himself a goal. He liked to set a goal that was, it would typically seem like it was above and beyond what would be normal. And he didn't really care if somebody, like when you make 1,000 bottles of wine, that's not really a typical thing to do, right? Make 100 bottles of wine, that seems like sufficient, right? But for my dad, he liked to set a goal that was kind of over the top, and mostly to just really challenge himself. And then he wouldn't set a goal just, kind of like pie in the sky. If he had something that he thought was interesting or important, then he had to figure out logistically, how could he actually make this thing work? And so he was, in that regard, he was kind of like an army sergeant, if we went off to pick choke cherries in the morning to make, his next annual batch of Toke cherry wine to get to his 1,000 bottles. It wasn't like we were going off to have a happy little day of collecting berries. It was like we were going off to war. And I mean, in some cases, it was traumatic. I mean, we had to be up at a certain time, and we had to be in the car, and we had to be down there, and everything was really organized. Once my dad got all of the berries collected for that day, then everything would change. Then, we're on free time. We would wander around, explore the sand dunes, and do whatever we want. But when he had that goal in mind, whatever it was, that became his focus. And our trip was the same thing. Like, we got up in the morning pretty much every day before sunrise. We'd like to be on the water right as soon as the sun, as there was enough sunlight so we could launch through the breakers. And our goal was to make our miles for that day, and we would do everything possible to make our miles. If the ocean, we couldn't control the ocean, so, if the wind came up to a certain point, that was it. We spend the rest of the day, and we wouldn't worry about that. We'd go back to shore, and we spend the rest of the day, I'd practice guitar or whatever, but every day we had a goal, and yeah, he was very serious-minded in that regard,
Yeah. Well, I've been to the center of geographic center of Ontario, and I've been to all four corners. Probably the only people along with Buddy to do this. And then, of course, the hardest part was Nunavut, Manitoba, and Northern Ontario to get to that point. So I really like the word regiment, because when you're on short voyages or expeditions, you have to be regimented. And that's why I think you were successful. But Chris, when's the first time you met Don, and what did you think about that as far as his character?
He was a character, that's for sure. The first time that I called him up, because I just read the book and thought this would make a great story, I just, I wasn't sure what to expect. I just looked on, online and found his phone number, and I thought it would be unlisted, but it was there, and I thought, oh, great. Well, I'll just give him a call and let's have a conversation. And just on the phone, it was like, hi, Don, listen, I'm a big fan of yours. Read the book, but has anybody ever done a movie about your story? He goes, well, all sorts of people have come about making a movie, but, they're Hollywood. I'm only interested in the truth telling of the story. So I said, well, I'd be making a documentary. And as soon as he said yes, I was like, amazing. And then he just talked for another hour and a half about all their adventures that they'd been on. It was like, and the whole time I'm thinking, this would be awesome if I could capture him telling these stories. But it was just like, I just listened for an hour and a half of him telling me the stories of them, of Don and Dana traveling, and Jeff starting out traveling to the Amazon. And I was just in awe. And then I said, listen, we have to meet up soon, and I'll come and visit you. And he said, yeah, that's where I got another layer of Don.
Why did you guys decide to do this? What was the reason behind going all the way down to from Winnipeg all the way down to the Amazon? Was this something that kind of developed over time, or was this the goal right from the get-go?
It's a great question, because there's a mixture of reasons and motivations for doing it in the first place. And it did evolve to some degree, So number one, as far as motivations and reasons for doing it, if I had to really say on a really gut level as to what was my primary motivating factor, it was very childish. I mean, it was me at 7 years old, having a sense of adventure. And then I think when I was about 9 years old, 9 or 10, when I bought my first little book, which is Tarzan. And I, from that, and also from my knowledge of stamp collecting and understanding geography and jungles and different things, and always being fascinated with the jungle, I told my dad that I had this idea that I wanted to walk to the jungle. And, like a lot of kids would do, for any different things, kids have different ideas. But my dad, just the way his mind is, instead of just kind of thinking of this as being a kind of a childish idea, to him, this was a kernel of an idea that motivated him to think about something, because at the same time, he at that same time that I had this idea, he was looking and searching for something monumental that he could do with his two sons that would kind of give us a worldly experience and give us a goal, because he had just recently been divorced, and he was looking for something that would give us direction, and he was also looking for something that was impossible to do, because he was not tired of, but he so many times he would set goals and he would achieve them, and then he felt like he had underachieved because he hadn't set the bar high enough, and he still had more to give, and he wanted to challenge what he was capable of doing. So this idea of me walking to the jungle, then from that kind of morphed into an interest in a trip, but when he would go to work each morning, he would go over the Red River, and this idea started to evolve in his mind of, well, if you went south on this river, how far could you go? Well, you would get, he's heard about people going across the divide and then getting onto the Mississippi and going down to New Orleans. And that's usually where they end. He said, but, could you continue on from there? And so with research, he finds out that there's the intercoastal waterway linking from New Orleans all the way to the Mexican border. And then you look there on better maps and you can see little bays and you can see lagoons and different things and channels. And maybe you could get in there. And other places, there's no channels, but the Mayans used to paddle down those coastlines, and they didn't have any maps, and they were superstitious. Maybe we could paddle those distances. So he started to string all of these adventures from the old explorers together, and he created this distance. He thought it would be kind of romantic to end up in the mouth of the Amazon. And it was just kind of, and it just seemed so far away. It seemed kind of an impossible, he said, when we left, he said, people used to say, well, what are you guys going to do when you get to the ocean? He said, how are you guys going to paddle in the ocean? My dad would say, I don't know. He said, I don't even know if we're going to get to the ocean. When we get to the ocean, we'll figure that out,
Yeah, that's the kind of guy he was. And so in my mind, we recently had Adam Schultz on. Adam Schultz is a contemporary adventurer in Canada, has done long trips across the Arctic and paddled this way and that way. He's got 4 or 5 books out now. But your expedition reminds me of certainly a little bit of Ernest Shackleton and also the Kon-Tiki expedition that, and that'll be its legacy. And then Chris, over to you. Your film will be a legacy too, because you've captured aspects of, in my written piece, and I'm working on it as we speak, I put in there that the film kind of connects the dots for me, connects the personalities and makes it come alive, because the book is one thing, but now the film is the other. And further to Ben's question, then your odyssey too, in taking 24 years to make this, take us back and through that in detail as well, because people need to know that putting this together was not easy because of when it occurred, and there was not videotape back in the day, and they had to survive, because some days were like that, and we'll get to that in some other questions. But over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Bill. I have to say, like Don and Dana's adventure thing, I don't know if we'll even get there. I kind of had the same idea going into this, because this was my first project as a documentary filmmaker. I'd been working for a company that had done some, really interested in the medium, and so just around that time when I thought I need a great project to sink my teeth in, I'd been given the book by a friend and read the story and thought to myself, why didn't I know about this story? It was so enormous. It's such a big piece of Canadian history. So that was surprising to me, and I thought this would be a great story to tell. So that's why I ended up getting in touch with Don, and was pleasantly surprised that he would, allow me to share that story. So that was back in 2000 when I read the book, 2001 when I started the conversation with Don at the time. Lucky to find out after we've done an interview with him and he gave us all sorts of great stories sitting beside his fireplace. which, by the way, that's how he heated his house, with just this one fireplace in his house. Like he would like to save money, and he wouldn't want to spend any money on heating bills if he could afford it on gas or propane. So he heated his place in the dead of winter, like Winnipeg winter, with his fire stove. So we set him up there. He told us all these great stories, and this became the basis for the rest of the film and how it was going to go. But because I hadn't undertaken a project like this before, and I tried to get some funding behind it, but a lot of broadcasters will go, "Oh, it's a great story, but sorry, we can't help you." So I thought I'd just have to do it myself. And as luck would have it, just as I was asking Don for his second interview, he said, "Oh, I won't be able to make it this summer. I'm going on a trip." And I thought, "Oh, well, that kind of kiboshes his story a little bit." And then he says, "Oh, I'm going down the Mississippi with my sons to a reunion tour." And I said, a little seed kind of grew in my mind of saying, "Oh, I wonder if I can get on that part of that adventure for a short time." And he hummed and hawed, but I talked myself and my brother, who's also a filmmaker, onto a portion of their trip, heading from Vicksburg, Mississippi down to New Orleans. And that's where I got more of the story and actually got to really know the people behind the story, Don and Dana. That's the first time I met Dana. And I was always kind of struck about how similar but how different these two men are. And I could sort of put myself, because at one point my brother left, and I was in the canoe with them for several days, right? So I was like Jeff. I was sort of going to the New Orleans with these two guys, and I was immersed with them, and it was a lovely thing. So a lot of starts and stops with the story. I was able to go so far with what I got, then I kind of said, "Oh, I need more," or I found out more. Then I'd go to Mexico to interview one of the people that was involved in the story, Gabby. And it was just kind of stops and starts. Sometimes just kind of I get discouragement that, as I've been working on this so long, and I just put it aside. And then I'd come around to it, or I'd talk with Dana, and we'd have a great conversation about something, and then I'd be inspired again. So these things kind of were the reasons why 24 years have kind of passed since I started this journey myself.
I want to talk about, and I'm glad you mentioned Gabby, because he's a character in the book, and of course Dana and Don and Jeff met him at the time, I think, and because Jeff, I think, left in November 3rd of the first year. But when you met Gabby, I'd like you to, Dana, talk about Gabby, and then, of course, Chris, he was pivotal when you did the dramatizations in the film going back to Mexico. So, Dana, take it away.
So, when we got stuck in La Pesca, well, I mean, we were about 10 miles from La Pesca, and that's as far as we could make it along the Gulf at that point. We kept running out of food and stuff, and there was no real stores in the area where we could resupply, and we had so little knowledge of getting across through the breakers and everything. And eventually my dad just thought, maybe it's not possible for us to paddle the Gulf, So we had this sort of a backup plan that, if we couldn't make miles or whatever, we'll just stay where we are, We wanted to have this trip, and we didn't know if the weather would improve. We were there at the end of the hurricane season, so we were there at the worst possible time. And so eventually we ended up, we bumped into this guy in this little town called The Fish, La Pesca, and he took us down to Veracruz. We put our canoe on his truck, hauled everything down to Veracruz, and the idea was we were just going to spend the next year and a half living there because the trip was over. And so after about a month, my brother said, "Well, Dana, you've got your guitar and everything. You're practicing every day. You're having fun, but I've read through my electronics books, my engineering books, and I've kind of reached the limits of what I can do here. And so as much as I'd like to stay in Veracruz and hang out and be like a hippie for the next 2 years, I'm going to head back to school." And at that point, I knew there was a chance that that we could continue on if the weather improved. People said that it would improve in the spring, the Gulf would calm out, but there was no guarantees. And by the time we were ready to get going again, Jeff was already in school. But in the meantime, when we first got there, I couldn't speak more than a couple of words of Spanish. We get dropped off in Veracruz. We're staying at this crazy little hotel called the Rockamar. And so my dad says, well, we can't stay here. He says, like, we turn on the light, the thing blows up, there's a spark flying. Our table had 3 legs, and there was just this little rickety room. He says, we can't stay here. We got to find someplace better to stay, And so my dad went, he says, well, you guys just hang out here. He says, I'm going to go and see what I can find. And so my dad was out wandering around town, talking to different people, trying to see if there was some place that he could rent, for the X number of months, And what happened was Gabby, his mom was an English school teacher, and she taught English in Mexico. And Gabby had gone to school in Texas, and he could speak really, I wouldn't say like absolutely flawless English, but pretty much. He's very fluent in English. He could, and his English gets better every year. So, but even when we first met him, his English was, we could talk to him about anything. And he overheard my dad going through these, talking to people, trying to figure out a place to stay. And at the time, he was going to school and he was living in a boarding house. And so Gabby seized on the idea. He thought, well, I can help this guy out. I don't know who he is. I can help him get a place to stay, with the idea that he could improve his English. I think that was, if I remember correctly, that was one of Gabby's reasons. Gabby was always looking at ways to take himself to the next level. He's a very smart guy and very hardworking and just a super all-around guy, And so I think he looked at this as, here's who this person is, like a crazy person or whatever, but he speaks English and he helped us out. That's also how Gabby is. He's a very helpful person, And so we ended up staying with Gabby. Now, when we first mentioned, when he first started to find out about it, because Jeff was still there. That was right from the get-go that we met Gabby. And initially, we didn't have any idea of Gabby joining us at all. We were hoping that Jeff would come back, but once he got into school, he said, "No, I'm not confident that you guys are going to be able to continue on." And from what he remembered of the Gulf, he thought, kind of no way. And we put articles in the newspapers. We tried to get people to join us. And I've even got letters I've gone through my dad's letters recently, and I'm finding letters of people saying thanks, but no thanks, I'm doing this or whatever. And some of them good friends of his. And so then we said, well, who else could we possibly get us to join us, and we started working on Gabby. But when we first said, Gabby, would you be interested in, we said we've only got like 9,000 miles left to go. He was just like, you guys are like, he thought we were crazy. Like, there's no way. I don't think Gabby was even a really solid swimmer when we met him. And so he's like, I'm not going out on the ocean, and all this, but my dad and we just kept hitting him with all of the fun stuff that he would see and things like that. And after 4 months, we'd essentially brainwashed him into thinking this was a great idea.
Well, Chris, you had to count on Gabby as well, and that's an interesting part of the film, those dramatizations and what he did for you. And further to Dana's comments, he was a really helpful person. All those years later. Tell us about it.
Yeah, to Dana's point, he goes beyond the he's such a helpful individual, positive guy. And when, as I was saying, going through the process of what parts of the story should I focus on, I always thought that the Gabby story was always a really kind of like a turning point for the story. And I wanted to get some of the backstory of that. And so again, it took me a while to find Gabby and his existence, but I think between Don and Dana, they still had some old phone numbers, and I eventually got through to him. And I said, listen, would you be interested in doing an interview? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, okay, I can make some time, and we figured out a time to meet. And I have to say, from the time we got to Mexico, to Veracruz, he picked us up at the airport. He put us in a 5-star hotel that night. He said, okay, I've taken some time off work, and he was running a successful eco company that dealt with ships, and I was like, wow, it's like, this is amazing, and because I can't even speak the language, so he basically, I called it my 10 days with Gabby, because he was such an integral part of telling the story that I need. I couldn't even fathom what I would get. And I didn't expect much. I just went to get an interview with him, and I thought that would be about it, and get some B-roll of, the scenery of the environment. But, it's like, as I saw his can-do attitude, he became so much more. He became like a producer on the show almost, and he had his phone. He was calling up because I know a fishing village we can go to. We can get some images. Maybe we get some people. And it was like, oh, great. So we, I guess just to pull it all together quickly is that there I found myself in this small fishing village that he, maybe Dana, that's where you guys originally met, but this is where he spent a lot of his childhood youth, in this fishing village, gorgeous little place, and on the river, and that, he had managed to gather up the townspeople and tell them that we're going to be doing some recreations, and that if they wouldn't mind all coming around here, and there I am pointing out people that could play different characters in the film. At one point, we had 3 Dons playing 3 Dons. And now we had the beard, again, looking for things that we could find to sort of make this kind of come together believably. It was actually quite incredible because Mexico is not a canoe culture. And Gabby finds a canoe in the middle of nowhere, and he has the townspeople paint it the color of the Oriana. And we find some stickers in town, we slap them on, or we paint the name on the boat. And then it's like, okay, here's Mexican Don number 1, Mexican Don number 2. Because at one point, Gabby actually plays Don, because the guy that was originally him, had to go somewhere. So it was like, we need to finish up the shot. So we got our character. The other funny thing was that although we got a canoe, we didn't have any paddles, because I say it's not a paddling culture there in the sense of canoe paddling. So again, Gabby goes, what can we do to get paddles? So we go to the market, the food market, and he goes, I know. And we go marching, I'm following him, to the baker. He goes to the baker. He goes, I'd like to buy 2 of your baking paddles. And the baker goes, oh, okay. And he hands him some money. And we've got 2 of these giant, they're really thick though and heavy. But we use them. And that's what the characters in the film end up using to paddle the canoe, the Oriana. And, I just remember myself at one point feeling a little like Francis Ford Coppola at the end of the day at this tiny little restaurant on the river, making my notes on a napkin for the next day's shoot, right? And thinking, wow, this is like really living, and I was so connected to the story through Gabby, who was making so many things happen. I was just blessed to have him on board.
Yeah, no, that's that's one of the things. He's in the book, but he's also in the film, and those things have to be, they're there forever. Part of Dana, the 20,000, approximately 20,000 kilometers and 12,000 miles. What intrigued me, because I have paddled the ocean, not to your extent, and I did ask you. I narrowed it down to 4 questions, which I always try to ask questions perhaps that no one's ever asked before, but I'm sure this has been asked. But paddling on the ocean is akin to paddling whitewater. I mean, I know when I've been on the ocean or in, you're thinking all the time. It's not like when you're paddling down the river and you can let your mind go elsewhere for a period of time. But I don't think so on the ocean. And so that intrigued me that, again, almost half of those distances were on the ocean, and you've alluded to that, but I don't know, by examples or otherwise. I mean, again, getting off the shoreline, getting to the shoreline, making your way from points of land, and you're too far out in the ocean and can't see all these things. But try to tell us about paddling the ocean, and I know, because I know Gabby was nervous about paddling the ocean, so maybe something about paddling the ocean that you can tell people that this is different.
Sure. Honestly, Bill, I could talk to you for days on end about the ocean. That's just such a fascinating subject. There's one little thing I just wanted to add into what Chris was saying, because I thought it was just something that kind of struck my interest, and this is nothing to take away from Gabby in any which way in his creative ways of problem solving, but I just wanted to make this little point about, one of the most fascinating things we learned throughout our trip, going through the third world countries, is that, there's so many people that we met that have very little in the way of resources financially and different things. And the amazing thing is, part of that culture is the ability to think and problem solve, because when they have a problem, they can't just go to a grocery store or go to a department store and buy something. They have to solve this problem some way, in a simple way. And it's a beautiful thing about that culture, that something that we noticed a lot is that, you see this in all cultures, but I noticed it particularly in the countries that we traveled through, that people, they have a situation they need to solve. They need to make a boat or a net or an arrow or whatever it is, and how creative they are, because really they don't have any other choice. They have to figure out some way to solve this problem on their own. And they really spend a lot of time thinking through these things. And some of the ways that they solve these problems, they're really genius. We saw some things that people did, like natives, people might look at them and think this guy is right out of the Stonehenge, or Stone Age. And we look at this guy and we think, that is an absolutely miraculous piece of work that you've done there. Like a native guy that we saw that literally carved a high chair with moving parts out of a solid piece of wood.
Amazing.
Just from looking at it once at a mission. And he memorized the entire thing in his head and then carved it out of one big giant piece of wood.
And that's why we're trying to transition to the ocean. But the point being is that this is why I have my persona of Backroads. All the things on the backwaters and the backroads, when you meet these interesting people, and again, the geography is about the people and the land, and that's a perfect example of that's why we need to travel on the backroads and the backwaters. But back to the ocean anyway.
Right. So, number one, I was a little bit curious, so I can get a perspective, maybe a better perspective on this. Is you had mentioned that you've done some ocean paddling. I was really curious to know, Bill, what coastline you've paddled along.
Yeah, well, the couple of examples on the east coast of Canada, and of course on Florida, but just going out for day paddles and things, and going from point A to point B, short distances, nothing like paddling all day and for days on an end, but just the mechanics of the waves and things. It's different than whitewater, and it's a whole different thing. Again, getting onto the water, getting off to the water, and those kinds of things.
Yeah. So again, I'm just really curious here, Bill. On the East Coast, would that be like Newfoundland area or no? Yeah.
Well, once in Newfoundland and once in Nova Scotia. So again, different. The wind's coming from different direction. The water behaves differently in a channel. One was on Grossmorn on that side, the west side of Newfoundland. So being on the water there, but it's always that rocky, rolly kind of thing that first of all you just got to get used to.
Right. And I'm sorry, but I'm just so curious. In Florida, where in Florida?
Yeah, close to Sarasota, Florida, Longboat Key. So, you're on the Gulf, but again, the wind tends to come towards you, and you rent a boat, and then, of course, you sneak into a mangrove and go in a back channel, come out, sort of thing, and all of a sudden the conditions are different.
Yeah, because I know all that coastline really well. I don't know the Newfoundland coastline at all. I've never been there. But I do know that because we paddled from where I live here in the Quad Cities down to Key West, Florida, and we did that whole stretch on both sides. So the thing is, the big difference with ocean paddling, of course, is that if you're on open coast, then there's nowhere to get any protection if the wind is coming on shore. I mean, if the wind gets to a certain level, I mean, that's it. You've got to be on shore. There's only so much you can handle. Even though we were covered over, you can't get anywhere if you're taking two strokes to go through a breaking wave, and you have to face into it, or else it'll knock you over, so eventually you just have to come into shore. The other thing that I'd say, like, the number one problem with paddling on the ocean for us was always launching. Especially like on place like, say, the Gulf of Mexico, for example, it's all pretty much one big long sand beach. There are some stretches with mountainous coastline, but most of it is sand beach. So there is no way. There's no protected entrances or cause. If you went in somewhere to get protection, you still have to come back out again. It doesn't help you. You still got to get down the coastline. So with stretches of ocean like the Gulf, and there's a lot of the coastline that we did was like that. It's just miles and miles of sand beaches with the big breakers coming in. And what we learned early on was that the secret to launching the canoe on the ocean was always where you landed. And so for us, when we were out paddling during the day, we had this primary goal of making miles. But our second most important goal was, where are we going to land? Because if we had made our good miles during the day, like say we had made even 20, 25 miles, we would consider that very, very good progress on the coastline. And we saw a place that looked like the breakers were easier, like for us, like an easier launch spot would be a more gradual set of breakers. What we didn't want to have is a steep beach, because we can't get enough momentum off the shore to get through that first breaker or two. We need a bit of a gradual thing so we can get into, we can handle the first little breakers that have made it through, but we've got to get out into the main, out and past the main breakers. And to get there, if you can have a gradual set of them, we can get through the little ones. Once we're in deeper water, then we can clip off the top of the big breakers and we can still have a chance. But if you've only got one or two breakers, so we are always looking for that perfect beach. If there was nowhere to get in, which most of the time there wasn't, in a really rare circumstances, you might have, like say kind of a bluff, a point of land, and some kind of a height, and a little bit of a tuck around. And depending on the wind direction, we might be able to land in on the inside of that and get a little tiny bit of a break. But most of the time, unless you actually had a port, like in a town or a city where they actually have breakwaters, which is so rare, you're pretty much always on your own. You got to land that canoe somewhere. And sometimes we didn't have any choice whatsoever. The wind would just come up, and we knew it was a bad place to land, but we didn't have the choice. We just land there and hope in the morning that we could get back out again. That's all we could do.
Yeah, no, I really like the perfect beach statement. Now, Chris, because of the time of the expedition and the distance, tell us a few challenges. And of course, it was a labor of love over many years. Tell us some of the challenges. I know the ocean would have been a particular challenge to capture all the elements of the trip from start to finish. And again, that's why the documentary film is it 2 hours and 12 minutes? I think that's how it goes. But tell us about that.
It's 131 minutes long. So as I alluded to earlier, just trying to get a canoe and some paddles out there was an interesting prospect. And then when we did, it was time to, film some of the dramatizations of the water. And we had people that in the canoe, the Oriana, that were familiar with the water, but not maybe familiar with paddling so much. And so we didn't have some of the biggest breakers, the kind that Don and Dana would have been trying to get past. But we did have our fair share of rough waters that we had to get past with the canoe. And so we would have Don, Dana, and I'd be in the middle, and just trying to get the canoe past these breakers, as small as they were. It was really challenging. We went over several times, but this also became fodder for the film, right? Because I had my camera zipped up in a plastic bag. So whenever time we went over, it was just like, okay, I could probably use that later. I don't even know what I captured at the time, but it was like, okay, well, that I'm sure will come in handy somewhere. And then these paddles were really heavy, and these guys, their arms were getting really tired, and we're just trying to get out beyond the breakers so we can, maybe go along the coast a little bit. I can capture a little bit about that. I was also on a boat following the canoe, but I could relate what Dana was just talking about in a small way, because we were under controlled circumstances in smaller waves, about the swells and the energy it takes for you to get out and then try to get back in without tipping. And they had their canoe was full of you had I don't know, 1,000 pounds.
We have about 500 pounds of gear, and then ourselves included on top of that. But about 500 pounds,
right? And
that would have been at times when we were fully loaded with food and stuff. But every day going through our food supply, by the time we come to a month goes by, our weight would change dramatically from 1 month to the next. But
which changes the dynamics of the canoe and the water as well. Yeah, absolutely. Good. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
I was just saying, so it was a good, something I could also feel now that I experienced that a bit. I could also relate that to the story and kind of get into Don and Dana's head a bit about what the fear that they would have daily about trying to get out, trying to get back in, where they're going to survive. The weather conditions were the worst of times during the seasons that they were trying to get out on, or just kind of maybe starting to get a little better. But I mean, it was able to put me into the mindset a little bit of what was going on.
You didn't have life jackets.
No. And I think initially the reason my dad dropped the life jackets was simply we just had no room for them. We had so much stuff, and he wasn't very particularly concerned about us drowning on the Red River. It's like so. It's like if we should flip, I don't ever remember. I never flipped over in a canoe ever. The first time we ever flipped over was in the Gulf, and it was almost like an insult. It was like, what? we don't tip over. We know what we're doing, right? But the ocean had a different perspective on that. They do whatever it want. But that it really just started off with that. It wasn't like my dad was trying to snub life jackets or anything. We just didn't have room for them. And then by the time we got down to the Texas coast, and from Port Isabel, well, we had a lot of confidence in our ability. And the thing is, it's not like we're paddling miles off to sea. We're following along the shore just outside the breakers. And if you flip over, there's only one thing you can do. You got to get into shore. You can't just float around in your life jacket and think somebody's going to come and save you. There's nobody anywhere that's going to even knows where you are. So we have to save ourselves. And how are you supposed to swim with a life jacket? We can hold on to the canoe. Absolute worst case scenario, we could have tossed everything out of our canoe, got back in the canoe and paddled to shore. It wasn't like we had no options, but the life jackets for us, for the most part, they just didn't really seem like anything that was really adding anything to our circuit. Like if you're lost at sea and you have no flotation, great. I mean, that would truly be a lifesaver. It could keep you up, when you have no more power to swim. But we couldn't be floundering out there in the ocean for days. We had to get ourselves to shore.
It's interesting though that you're talking about the dangers of being on the water. But one of the things that happened too is just not on the water, but when you guys were actually on shore, there, by your recollection, Dana, this said that you had at least 13 encounters with people who threatened you guys at gunpoint. So this was something where not just were you fighting the elements, but you were also, in a place where it's a completely different culture, and you're in these very dangerous situations that are taking place on land.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, Bill, is we could list off, depending on how we want to look at being at gunpoint X number of times, But I think what's really interesting about each one of those situations is to literally look at each one, specifically what happened in that circumstance and what we went through and what the people were doing, because there's so many interesting elements about those circumstances. Like if you take from the very first one, which was when we first entered Mexico, and here we are, we're in it. I guess the first time I'd ever been outside United States. Like you go from Canada to United States, yeah, it's a different country, but by and large, we're a very similar culture. I mean, if I was to take you and put you, on the street here where I live, you might just as well think you're in Toronto. You wouldn't necessarily even know that there's any great difference. It's the trees look the same, everything, But when you go into Mexico and you've got, everything is really different. The culture is different, the different language and everything. You're in somewhere new. So we're already kind of, and you hear all the stories, long before we left Canada, you're going to get robbed and there's going to get shot at and all these things. So you got all these things going on in your mind. So you have these preconceived idea of how there's going to be all these bad things happening and whatever. So no, we already got all that paranoia in our minds. We've crossed into Mexico. We have some papers, but we're not crossing at a border crossing. We're just there. And we're trying to figure out how to get our canoe on the coast, and we're trying to make our miles. Next thing you know, we got this big army truck comes rolling up, all loaded up with soldiers, and they've all got big military guns. So yeah, we're terrified. We don't know, these guys are going to come up and say we did something wrong, shoot us. You don't know. So my dad says, Dana, Jeff, just, be calm, just sit there. And he says, well, and so, right from the beginning, it turns almost into a Laurel and Hardy situation instead of military, because this big truck of soldiers, they're all sitting in just the back of an open truck. They all come rolling up, and the captain orders these guys out, and he orders them to go over and basically kind of inspect us. But the problem is that where we are, there's a little bit of a tidal lagoon, a strip of salt water that's maybe 10 or 15 feet across, and, maybe this deep. That's just has overlapped the beach during the high tide and is filled with salt water. And all these soldiers with their big military rifles, they come stomping up to this piece of water, and they stop dead in their tracks because they don't want to get their boots wet. And the captain gets really upset with them because they're all kind of looking at each other trying to figure out what to do. And he's get over there and check these guys out, So now we're just sitting down there, and they're looking at a canoe. They're asking us questions and different things. My dad brings out his papers that show from when we were in Veracruz this is before that. So all we had at that point, we probably had a letter from Canada saying what we were doing in Spanish. That's it. And this guy reads through this and tries to figure out what we're doing there, and we're trying to explain to him we're on this canoe trip. I mean, the whole thing is crazy. There's no logical reason what we're doing, right? But we try to explain to this captain that we're on this expedition and everything, and he says, Mexico is a friendly country. He said, have a safe trip. And it ends there. We don't get shot at, and as it turns out, we go through around 1,300 miles of Mexican coastline. And we do have a couple little gun incidences here and there where people come out, they think we're up to something, but nobody ever shoots at us. We never got robbed once in Mexico.
Yeah. Well, I've got a couple of questions, one for each of you. Chris, and I'll start with you. Looking back, I mean, there's only one Don Starkel, and this there was only one paddle to the Amazon. and lots of people have done their own challenges. I hope to have someone that actually did a trike bike ride to the South Pole, but that's in contemporary times. Because I had asked Dana in an email about what's changed, and he talked about cell phones. But Chris, when you look back, like what are your fond recollections or of Don or what you did? And again, this will, although it took a long time, this will be a legacy piece and things like this where we were able to capture a lot of these moments that are in the book and in the film, but extended. But what do you think when you look back at this?
Well, I was very fond of Don from the get-go. He was such an open personality. He seemed to, people gravitated towards him because he was that kind of person that, would listen, but he also liked to tell a story. And it was always like positive messaging that he would tell stories about. Being on the trip with Don and Dana, and just, again, because I'm the cameraman, the documentary filmmaker, I'm observing, and it's part of what I do, observe human nature. So, watching father and son communicating, talking, sharing ideas, and then just being with Don and watching him with we had two other young men from Iowa with us, Josh and Jason. And, again, I'm kind of like the fly on the wall. Sometimes, a lot of the times, people don't even know I'm recording them. So I got all these great intimate moments where Don would be sharing some advice with Jason around the fire or something like that. And the boys really gravitated towards him, just like most people that knew Don. He could be a taskmaster sometimes, and that's what got him to, made him the man he was. But he also had a really gentle side and a nurturing side, and he wanted to sort of leave a good example to people about what can be done in life, and maybe how you could lead your life as well.
Yeah, and Dana, that's a good segue, Dana. And so this question is, and I think Don passed in 2012, which would be what 14 years ago, and you speak about this in the film, but closer to your family. And your son, and post the reunion tour, anytime you get into a canoe, and you may be with your son, and how do you, the question is that whole transition of your relationship with your father and with your son in certainly totally different circumstances, different people. What goes through your mind sometimes when you might see your son in the bow of the canoe? And that might have been the first time that happened. What were you thinking? Because you were in the bow of the canoe too.
Right. Yeah, last summer I took my son for our first real canoe trip. He was at 13 at the time, and he'd been in the canoe with us. I've been in the canoe with him lots of times, but well before that. But our first real kind of a canoe trip, just a little river in Iowa, in the Illinois side, actually in Illinois, that's kind of goes somewhere between Chicago and here in the Quad Cities. But we just spent a couple of days just alone on the river, and for the most part, there was very little boat traffic and stuff. And yeah, the moment I get in that canoe, there's a million thoughts go through my mind. I'm transported back to all of my experiences, going back to Caddy Lake in Manitoba when I was a young kid, going on canoe trips with my dad. We did all kinds of northern trips, the Amazon trip, the Mississippi, all of it collectively, all of those experiences are always there. And every moment that you're on the water, you come around a bend in the river, and there's always filtering through your mind memories, and you go under a bridge, you remember going under a similar bridge or whatever, and it's just all of that. I think the biggest thing with canoeing is that there's just something about canoeing that you're traveling at this slow speed, lots of time to think, you kind of get immersed in it, and they talk about flow activities, where your mind is just kind of caught up in those moments to the point where everything just kind of dissolves. And the more that I've studied about things like that and read about them, the more that I can understand. I mean, so many times I've been on these trips, and when you come back, that's one of the things that always stands out in my memory so much is the distortion of time. It's just unbelievable sometimes, the time distortion feeling that you have. It's like, you could be gone for a matter of a couple months, but somehow those months feel like 50 years of time in some ways. And in other ways, they seem like a moment, but it's very different than day-to-day life, because I can look back 30, 40, 50 years of my life, and for the most part, each year kind of dissolves into the next. It almost seems like, I can go back 50 years and it just seems like a relatively short amount of time. But if I look at the Amazon trip, those 2 years feel like more like 80% of my entire life. So there's a really strange thing going on with time there. And I don't know, and I think it is linked to this flow thing where our mind, when we're so immersed in certain things, time, the way that our mind registers time changes.
Yeah, and I say that's as an educator as well. I'd say that's an excellent answer, and I'll tell you why. Because that's what COVID did to all of us too. Because when we think back now, I have to think back. There's a distortion in time. I really like those pros. That pros is that I can't remember the important things before COVID. It might have been 5. It might have been 7. But I get that wrong. Just because COVID was that moment in time where we were just immersed in nothing. I guess in essence, but. I'm really liking that your memories are excited, and the whole all of your conversation here today has been great visualization. And so not only do we have the book, which we recommend people finding just about anywhere, and the film, and of course in my print story that'll come out, and I think Ben will get this included in the Backroads Bill podcast. But I don't know, Ben, final last words to you, because we could go on for hours, and this is probably the longest Backroads Bill podcast, and you're going to have to work to do a little bit of editing. We don't have timelines anyway, but it's been, this has been, this whole thing is, I won't tell the listeners so much because it's been serendipitous kind of to find Chris through another Chris and then find Dana. And here we are all today. And Ben, over to you.
Yeah, it's been absolutely fantastic getting to listen to the three of you guys talk. I had so many questions, but I think you covered most of it. Like there's so, and again, we could probably talk for another 2 or 3 hours.
Here's the offer, Ben. It's only it'll be 50 years in 6 years. So maybe we'll have to have the reunion tour of the Backroads Bill podcast.
There you go. But this is such an interesting story because you have just the ability to go from when, just the physicality of going down there, the dangers that you went through both on and off the shore. There's just so much that you could kind of go over. There's also, of course, Danny, your guitar playing and your and how that's inspired you. You're a classical guitarist right now. You've had, I think, 7 albums. Is that correct?
I've done different EPs back in the day with vinyl and different things, but my main recordings right now are 3 compact discs. I have a Renaissance album, I have a Baroque album, and I have a Spanish album. And I've really gotten back into my electric guitar over the last about 7 or 8 years. So I'm spending about equal amount of time on electric guitar soloing and working on Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen, Satriani, and all these different guys. I love working on their solos. Some of those guys are just absolutely amazing, and I find it endlessly fascinating figuring out how the heck they do what they do, And but hey, Ben, I was going to just say, I love answering questions, but I just wondering before we go, if there's any particular. You said you had a lot of questions. If there's any one particular question that stood out, if you had one more question, because I would love to be able to give you an answer for anything you had on your back of your mind,
Yeah, I guess the last thing was just really did you guys cross the border at all? Or did you just paddle through stuff? How did that work going between country to country?
It doesn't work at all. We had to cross, we went through 13 countries, right? So, but we started in Canada. So I guess we would say we crossed 12 borders. And we went into every single country illegally. And we didn't have a choice because we're traveling in a weird way. We're not traveling by car. We don't arrive at a border and you check through. We arrived like at the American border right off the bat. We crossed the border on the Red River. There's nothing there. That's what's so bizarre is like, if you go like 3 miles through the bush, you've got Fort Knox. You can't get through it. I can't even bring a banana across the border. But you go 3 miles through the bush, you could take a nuclear reactor across the border and everybody be like, well, have a nice day. There's no, most borders are just a river or something like that. Unless when you finally get to an actual city or town, which could be 20, 30, 40, 50 miles into the country, that would officially be your port of entry if you're on a ship. But us being in a canoe, it might take us 3 or 4 days just to get there. And then they always wonder, well, where did we come from? And then they want to know the tonnage of our ship and who's the captain and all that stuff. And it's like, and you can't explain half of this stuff to anybody, but that was our best strategy because the reality is that if we had, let's say we were in Mexico and we drove into Belize and to get permission to get into the country, and then I had to drive back. Like, how would you even do that? We couldn't do that. So the only way that we could enter these countries was just go in, arrive at the first place. They'd say, well, how come you don't have permission to be here? We're like, we just got here. This is where we are.
Yeah, no, it was a different time when you think about 44 years. Okay, Ben, back to you.
Yeah, and I just have one more question for both of you guys.
Yeah, we could have 1,000 questions. I know. Maybe we should do a part 2 and just keep going. But anyway. So one last question. If there was one, because you both had different experiences. Obviously, Danny, you went like through it. Chris, you went through the process of kind of recreating this. If there was one or two, if there's too many, key things that you took away from this trip, what would you say that it was?
Key thing to take away from this trip, I guess it's a testament of Don is to never give up. He was that kind of person, and he kind of started my journey of like documentary filmmaking and a project that I wouldn't give up on. And as challenging as it was, he was kind of like a bit of a beacon for me to follow, the light at the end of the tunnel. In fact, I remember one time he said to me when I was there, he wasn't well, and I was at his home, and I was like going through some old material, that Super 8 footage, which, by the way, I have to say, he was a treasure trove of collection of. He had like an amazing wealth of material that he had single-handedly captured from news stations along the way, Super 8 footage, photos, his book. He was just a wealth of knowledge, or wealth of material for a documentary filmmaker. But at one point, we were sitting on his sofa bed, and he was looking at some material that I had put on so he could tell his stories about them. And he kind of looks at me sideways, and he goes, if you haven't accomplished what you wanted to do by the time you're 50, you're probably not going to make it. and it was like a stiff reminder, because he was kind of coming to the end of his days, was that don't forget, finish this project. And I did. And that's because I had him to look to follow, or he was kind of a bit of a mentor in that kind of way.
Ben, when I look back to when I was a young kid, there's one of the strings that I think runs true to my dad from the time I was a little kid right to the last day that I knew him, was this idea of dealing with fear. Because I think when my dad was a young kid, there was a lot of things that he never did, and he used to say it was because he didn't have a dad to give him a kick in the butt, to do anything, and I can remember so many different times and so many experiences, and one of the elements of that thing was dealing with an element of fear. The fear was mostly in my mind, a fear of an unknown situation. And my dad had already experienced those things. He had gone through them, knew that they were doable. He felt they were relatively not as risky as a person might think. And he wanted us and my brother and I to have these experiences so that we weren't held back by these fears. And he felt so much that, when you look at a lot of times in a person's life, so many of the things that they want to do, that they really want to do, and deep down inside, their fears of all the things that could go wrong or whatever so often can trip them up in different ways, whether it's just procrastinating or just never doing them at all, And then so that that was something he always was, pushing through that, trying to push through that fear, because he had just come to know from so many experiences that, when you look at a situation, you have all these things in your mind that could go wrong, but he just knew that from doing different things that most of the time, very few of these things ever happen. I mean, we hear this from Mark Twain and so many different people, quotes in funny ways, and it's the same thing. But it was something he really wanted us to understand and feel in our core from the time we were little. And then I think, as far as, in the process of living life, I think one of my dad's guiding principles was just simply respect. Respecting other people, trying to respect cultures, trying to understand people and be empathetic to understand where they're coming from. It's so easy to look at the world from our own perspective, not always so easy to really understand something from somebody else that has had a completely different experience, So like when we were little, going up to the native reserve, spending time on a reserve and learning to respect the natives up there in a way that we respected them, as put them on a pinnacle, for what the native people in Canada are, so many times growing up, my experience in Winnipeg, natives were talked about as, a guy that's drunk on the downtown Main Street. And my dad never wanted us to have that in our mind, as that is what represented native people. My dad had a great respect for native people, and I always have too. And it was that respect thing that he had for people was, I think, one of the nicest qualities that my dad had within him, just to try to understand other people.
Yeah, another R word. He was truly a Renaissance man. And the first part of that, again, I'm digging back into my education roots, is that he was teaching about risky play before the term ever came out about risky play, and beyond that, that's for sure. And that's something, when you read the story or look at the documentary, we can all take away a lot of these lessons. Ben?
Absolutely. I think that's a good place to end it, because I feel like we could talk literally all day.
We could,
which is amazing.
And that's why now I kind of understand from Chris's perspective why maybe in essence sometimes it took so long, because there was just too much to try to figure out, and then not by osmosis, but you know what I'm saying? It took a long time. But anyway, that's just rapid observations. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us, Chris and Dana. You can check out Paddle the Amazon, which was written by Dana's father, Don. Also, the documentary that was made by Chris. And again, thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your morning to join us here.
Hey, you're totally welcome, Ben.
Well, it's been an honor.
Well, we honestly could have talked for probably another hour or two. We kind of had to say, okay, maybe there's another episode in here down the line, because it was so amazing to get to chat with both Chris and Dana. Bill and myself very, very thankful for the opportunity. And there are talks of actually both Dana and Chris being at the launch of the Canoe Museum that Bill's going to be at. So maybe there's going to be another story to tell there. Maybe there's going to be another episode that we can get there. But again, a huge thank you for both of our guests for taking time out of their day to chat with us. And even though we usually go in with the guests saying, it'll be about 30 to 45 minutes, roughly, by the time you get them in and you start chatting and you get the episode going, they were very gracious. We probably honestly could have had them on for another 2 or 3 hours and they would not have complained. It was one of those things where we kind of had to do a hard stop, so we actually could do it. But there were so many more questions and so much more we could pull out of them. So again, hopefully we can get them back on the podcast in the future to maybe go and answer some of those unasked questions. So if you like today's episode, consider giving us a review or share, whatever platform you're listening on. It allows us to continue to grow and have guests on like Chris and Dana. You can also find more episodes of the Backroads Bill podcast on your favorite podcast players and over on NorthBayEcho.ca. And of course, new episodes, they come out every single Wednesday morning, so you can catch them bright and early there. And while you're on the North Bay Echo website, you can check out some of our other local podcasts we have, including To North Bay with Love, where actually yesterday we had Alan Hirsch on the podcast. And Alan is a former psychotherapist. He's done cartooning. He's done a lot of things since his retirement. And it was a great chat that he had with Lisa. He opened up about vulnerability, putting herself out there in a creative way. And it honestly was a really deep and honest and great conversation. So you can check that one out over on To North Bay with Love, again, favorite podcast players, or NorthBayEcho.ca. And finally, check out Echo Essentials, our newsletter, to keep up to date with everything happening in North Bay. It's free to sign up, and it comes to your email every Tuesday and Thursday. So join us again next week for yet another episode and another Backroads adventure.